Native American history has become intertwined with U.S. history. One of the darkest chapters of this shared history is the Indian boarding school period that began in the late 1800s. For over 100 years, Native American children were taken from their homes and tribal communities and placed in boarding schools. Often the Native children were relocated hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles from their families for a long period of time. The practice of placing Native children in boarding schools became a policy of the U.S. government as a means to assimilate them. The goal was to take the Indian out of the children in hopes to Americanize them. But the objective was to erase and replace Indian culture. The mantra was, "Kill the Indian, save the man." It is estimated that up to 500,000 Native American children were removed from their families and placed in boarding schools, although the actual number may never be known. In 1928, the U.S. government released the Merriam Report that described substandard living conditions at Indian boarding schools in 26 states. The report revealed overcrowding, poor nutrition, and lack of proper medical treatment. Even with the Merriam Report's dismal findings, Indian boarding schools existed decades later with only limited improvements. There are still active boarding schools operating in the United States today. Many Native Americans, for multiple generations, have lived with the trauma associated with the Indian boarding school experience. Too often, that trauma has led to alcoholism, drug abuse, high rates of divorce, and suicide. Various Indian boarding schools have graveyards that contain the remains of Native children who died while attending the schools. There is a movement to have the remains returned. During the summer of 2021, the remains of 10 children were returned to Rosebud Sioux Tribe from Carlisle Indian Boarding School. In May 2021, the world became aware of the legacy of boarding schools when the graves with the remains of 215 school children were found at the Kamloops Industrial Residential School in British Columbia, Canada. The discovery led U.S. Interior Secretary Deb Haaland to establish a federal Indian boarding school initiative.
We must shed light on the unspoken traumas of the past, no matter how hard it will be.
The initiative will include an investigation to identify past boarding schools, the location of known and possible burial sites, and the identities and tribal affiliations of the children who were taken there. Throughout the summer, more graves at other residential schools were disclosed. Tribal communities throughout the United States began to take action towards healing by holding talking circles, rallies, and marches. But healing does not occur with a one-time event, but is a long journey. All of Indian country is waiting for the results of the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative's findings, which are due in a report to Secretary Haaland by April 1st, 2022.
Welcome to the first of a three-part series of webinar discussions looking at the issue of boarding schools. My name is Valerie Vandepan, and I am the managing editor of Native News Online and one of the hosts of this program. Native News Online would like to thank our sponsors: Platinum presenting sponsor, Tunica Biloxi Tribe of Louisiana; Gold sponsor, Oath Inc., Yahoo Verizon Media; Silver sponsor, Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation; Bronze sponsors, Pokagon Band Potawatomi and Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to introduce Levi Rickert, our publisher and editor, of Native News Online.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Valerie. I have the pleasure of introducing a very special guest that we have with us this afternoon, and that is the Assistant Secretary of the Interior for Indian Affairs, Brian Newland. Mr. Newland is the past president of the Bay Mills Indian community based up in Brimley, Michigan. And good afternoon, Mr. Secretary. I don't see you yet. There he is. How are you, sir?
Ani, good afternoon, Levi. Thanks for having me.
Hey, it's our pleasure, and we really do appreciate you being here today. And if you don't mind, we'd just like you to start out, provide a quick overview of Secretary Holland's Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative, and then we may have some follow-up questions. Miigwech.
Miigwech. Ani buju, everybody. Gijip, Nibanam, Nikanan, Bamose, and Dishnakas, Mayan Dodem, Doshkaning, Donjba, Nishna, Bay, and Bao. My name is Brian Newland. I am the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs at the Department of the Interior, and I'm really honored to be with you this afternoon to speak about our work at the Department of the Interior on Secretary Holland's announced boarding school initiative. As you saw in the video at the beginning here, people around the world were moved to action with the discovery of hundreds of unmarked graves at the Kamloops residential boarding school in Canada. Those grave sites were the final resting place for Indigenous children, kids who died while enduring forced assimilation at residential boarding schools. The policy of using residential boarding schools as a way to break up tribal bonds and force Indigenous children to assimilate was used here in the United States. And for more than a century, Native children were taken from their families and placed in these schools where they were subjected to all manner of abuse. Too many of those kids didn't make it home because they died at those schools, often ending up in unmarked graves themselves. These boarding schools were an express policy of the United States federal government, and they were a core part of the federal government's effort to solve what it called the Indian problem, how to eliminate resistance to the taking of Indian lands, and how to remove further obligations to Indian people. The Department of the Interior and other federal agencies had a direct responsibility for funding and operating many of these schools. Up until this point, the federal government has never been willing or able to tell the story of the scale and the toll of this policy. In June, Secretary Deb Haaland changed that. She directed us to investigate the department's role in the operation of these boarding schools and to begin to tell the truth about the scale and the toll of the boarding schools. She also directed that we draft a report of our findings by April 1st of next year. Since then, we've been working to identify federal records relating to the operation of these boarding schools with a focus on identifying the sites where they operated, the names and tribal affiliations of students, and possible burial sites. It's been really difficult work. We've been trying to locate hundreds of thousands of records from locations across the country, all for a period spanning more than a century. It's also taken an emotional toll on the people doing this work and for thousands of people across Indian country. We've seen that in recent tribal consultation sessions where people from around Indian country have reminded us in very stark terms about the price that their relatives paid for this federal policy. Our next consultation session actually is tomorrow afternoon. Across Indian country, people understand the importance of this work and its relevance to their lives. But many Americans might ask why it's important for us to engage in this effort now and how it's relevant to our lives today. And I think it's crucial that people understand that there isn't a single Native person in the United States whose life hasn't been shaped by the operation of these boarding schools, whether they know it or not. From the breakup of families, to changing family names, to the loss of our languages and religious practices, to physical and sexual abuse, and so much more. These boarding schools have a very long tail that reaches our lives today. And this bears directly on the administration's efforts to do things like defending the Indian Child Welfare Act and break up cycles of domestic violence. We're actually working to defend the Indian Child Welfare Act in front of the Supreme Court right now. And last week, President Biden issued an executive order on addressing violent crime in Indian country. which directs us to also work to break up cycles of violence through prevention efforts. This work with the boarding school initiative also bears directly on our work to revitalize Native languages. One of the purposes of these boarding schools was to eliminate the use of Native languages across the country. Last week at the Tribal Nations Summit, the administration announced an interagency agreement to work with tribes to help bring those languages back, languages that we spent a century and millions of dollars to eradicate. And this work bears directly on our effort to protect tribal religious ceremonies and sacred places. Last week, President Biden announced protections for the Greater Chaco Canyon landscape in New Mexico, along with an interagency agreement to protect other places where Indigenous people continue to worship and practice their traditional lifeways to this very day. Again, those traditional cultural practices were the boarding school and operation and policy were focused on wiping them out. And we've got a lot more work to do on so many fronts, including telling the story of our history with the boarding schools. As we move toward our April 1st deadline from Secretary Haaland, it's important to remember that this is just the first step in the process of telling that story. Given the volume of information we're finding and the number of people who have come forward to offer their stories and assistance, we know that the work of telling this story will continue well beyond April 1st, and that the process of healing will take generations. But Secretary Haaland knows that we can't be daunted by that fact, and she's not going to let that deter us from engaging in this important work. And so I look forward to continuing to work with people from across Indian country, communities, universities, researchers, organizations that want to help to tell this story. I look forward to putting together this report on April 1st and sharing it with the public. And I look forward to the work that will follow on after that. So Levi, I want to say miigwech, thank you so much for having me here. It's a big honor for me to do this and an honor to be a part of this important work. And I'm glad to share this story with the country.
And miigwech to you, Mr. Secretary, Assistant Secretary. We really appreciate you taking time in your busy schedule. And please thank Secretary Haaland for establishing the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative. I think it was a moment for Indian country when she did that. And I remember her making the announcement at the National Congress of American Indians. And I think most of us got choked up. Here was a Secretary of the Interior who actually cared enough to start this initiative. So it's wonderful work you guys are doing. And please keep us informed. Native News Online is here to help spread the word for the fine work you're doing. Thank you again. Miigwech.
Miigwech. Thank you so much, Levi.
Okay. I'm going to turn this back to Valerie Vandepan.
Thank you, Mr. Assistant Secretary, and thank you, Levi. And forgive the bright light if it's shining over my face. I apologize. We again thank our Platinum presenting sponsor, the Tunica Biloxi Tribe of Louisiana. If you're just joining us, welcome to the first of a three-part series of webinar discussions looking at the issue of boarding schools. My name is Valerie Vandepan, and I am the managing editor of Native News Online and one of the hosts of this program. Thank you for joining us. Our first discussion today is about where we're at and how we got here. Our speakers are Christine Dindisi McCleave of Turtle Mountain, Ojibwe. She is the CEO of the National Native American Boarding Schools Healing Coalition, and Denise Lajmadir, Turtle Mountain, Ojibwe, and co-founder of the National Native American Boarding Schools Healing Coalition. She is also the author of Stringing Rosaries. Will Denise and Christine please join us?
Bonjour, hello.
Bonjour. All right. Well, while we wait for Denise, Christine, I'll ask you a question, which is I'm hoping that you can please put boarding schools into the context of the oppression of Indigenous people.
Yeah, I know you guys told me that question ahead of time, but it's still a big question to answer. Just like, you know, that video was really powerful, trying to explain 500 years of oppression. And basically, we know that from the onset of settler colonization on what Indigenous peoples call Turtle Island, that there were efforts to remove Indigenous peoples from our traditional homelands, layers of historical trauma that ended up happening from exposure to new diseases that we didn't have immunity to wars for territory, signing peace treaties under duress to stop the attack on our women and children and communities, all the way to broken treaty promises. And then probably the most devastating assimilation strategy and tactic that the United States employed was to take the promise of education through the treaties in exchange for all the land and educate our children in a way that eradicated our language, our culture. A lot of, you know, discussions were happening at our virtual healing summit this past weekend saying, let's not say we lost our language or lost our culture. We didn't set it down somewhere and forget where it was. It was taken from us, and in very brutal, inhumane ways. I see Dr. Lajmadir here is with us, and she has done, you know, research and can tell you a little bit more about some of those accounts of students who were just children who were taken to these schools and forcibly converted, forcibly assimilated, abused. Now, in some cases, we know that the boarding school history is a complex one. It depends on the school and the era that they attended schools. And some people received a good education. Others were forced to labor for the benefit of the school and these institutions. So it's definitely a complicated history, and one that in no doubt is part of that pedagogy of oppression, that it was aimed at disrupting our families and communities, weakening our tribal nations, and assimilating us into mainstream Western culture so that this nation could have access to our lands. So everything was really aimed at, you know, westward expansion of this country, the whole idea of manifest destiny, the doctrine of discovery being used in United States Supreme Court cases to justify taking our lands. Everything comes back to the land. And so when we look at this complex history and the impacts of this type of devastation, this type of human rights violations on children, it meets the United Nations definition of genocide. And we absolutely are applauding Secretary Haaland's initiative to investigate the federal policy to run these schools, the church's involvement in these institutions, and the lingering impacts, the historical trauma that we are dealing with in our communities. But we need to take it a step further. We also need to support the bill that is currently in Congress for a Truth and Healing Commission, like Canada that had a 5-year commission. We need to collect testimony from the students who attended these institutions. As I mentioned, the Boarding School Healing Coalition had a virtual healing summit this past weekend, and we heard directly from survivors who shared some really difficult memories of abuse and just brutal accounts that they witnessed at these institutions, these schools. And then we also heard from youth. We heard from our youngest generation who is really advocating for not just truth and healing or truth and reconciliation, but radical justice, change. They are absolutely aware that this is a legacy of oppression, and they want to see change happen. So I would encourage everyone to learn more about this, talk to your relatives, learn about your family's boarding school history. My grandfather went to a Catholic Indian boarding school, but he never wanted to talk about what happened to him there. And I know that sometimes these things are difficult for us to share and to unpack, but we've also been advocating for mental health resources to be bolstered by Indian Health Services. We asked Congress people, legislation people to send a letter this past summer to increase mental health support for our communities, as we had seen that the news coming out of Canada about the unmarked graves was really opening up a lot of unresolved grief and unresolved trauma. So if you are interested in getting involved and supporting Boarding School Truth, Healing, and Justice, head on over to boardingschoolhealing.org. We have plenty of education resources and ways for you all to get involved.
Wow, thank you so much, Christine. Certainly, boarding schools are just one part of a much larger strategy of oppression, and that legacy continues on, unfortunately. Denise, can you speak about the legacy of boarding schools?
Thank you all for being here today. I got kicked out when I turned on my camera, so that's why I kept my camera on. Well, in order to know the legacy of boarding schools, we need to understand we don't even know the full number of boarding schools in the United States. I've worked for the last 12 years trying to search for boarding schools. No one's ever asked, well, we did ask the government, but no one's ever asked the churches and so on how many boarding schools they ran. So far, between myself and NAB's Boarding School Healing Coalition researchers, we've come up with 408. So the legacy of these boarding schools is one of intergenerational trauma and historical trauma, which is defined as collective emotional and psychological injury over a lifespan and across generations resulting from the cataclysmic history of genocide. It is a legacy of numerous traumatic events that community experiences over generations. Over successive generations, we have experienced traumatic assaults that have had enduring consequences for our families and our communities. It is one of historical unresolved grief. This is resulting from the historical trauma of genocide, grief that has not been expressed, acknowledged, and resolved. And as Christine mentioned, I've interviewed many boarding school survivors as old as like 96 years old. And so many of them had never told their families, their kids or their grandkids, maybe their spouses, about the boarding school trauma. It was too traumatizing for them. So I say there's just this resounding silence, even amongst our survivors. There's disenfranchised grief, grief that can't be publicly mourned. One of the boarding school survivors, an older gentleman, he said, when do we talk about our trauma? When do we talk about what happened to us? At Thanksgiving table, old family, I was sexually molested from the time I was 5 years old to 10 years old in a boarding school. So it's that, again, that silence that they've kept inside of them. I think since Kamloops, there's been certainly collective grief out there, but more people talking about what happened to them. And I worry about that event, the news of that event has triggered a lot of our boarding school survivors. Something that's called boarding school syndrome. It is PTSD, including recurring intrusive memories, nightmares, flashbacks, detachment disorder, deficient knowledge of traditional culture and cultural skills, trouble sleeping, poor anger management, deficient parenting skills, tendency to abuse alcohol and drugs. I always ask, what did my parents learn to be parents? They were in boarding schools, and we never told they were loved or I love you or held. Instead, they were beaten, locked in closets. Neither one of them spoke English. My grandparents and so on. So so many of our people, where did they learn parenting skills? There's also the legacy of adverse childhood experiences, which disrupts brain, leading to a higher likelihood of negative health outcome as adults, including heart disease, obesity, diabetes, and autoimmune diseases. We suffer from disproportional cycles of violence, abuse, disappearance, health disparities, substance abuse, premature death, and undocumented psychological trauma. Boarding schools represent a deliberate policy of ethnocide and cultural genocide and human rights abuses. We consider them somewhere between dungeons and death camps. And I have found 2 dungeons, what the survivors call dungeons, at Fort Taunton, just down the road here in North Dakota. They were overcrowded, understaffed, underfunded, had limited resources, and places where diseases ran rampant. So now, 5.5 months ago, the news of Kamloops and the unmarked graves hit the national and international scene. I became overwhelmed with media requests from as far away as China, Beijing, Japan, Al Jazeera, and Australia. And I know the Boarding School Healing Coalition people are overwhelmed too, because seemingly the hundreds of requests I've got, I always refer them also to NABS. And like what Brian said earlier, it's taken a toll on us emotionally, because there's only a handful of us in the last 10 years that have consistently and continuously been doing boarding school research. So like I said, that news has triggered some of the people that I interviewed in my book, Stringing Rosaries, have contacted me and said, I'm not feeling good, I'm upset. And I always encourage them to go and get talk therapy. So now we have to look at, it's a healing coalition. So what we look at right now is, what does healing look like in Indian country from boarding school abuse? Miigwech. Thank you.
Stay with us, Denise. The Kamloops, it's so traumatic. You say all these words and it's deep and it's painful. And I'm so grateful that you're able to speak about it and that you're taking the time to share, because I know it's hard. You mentioned briefly that there's healing now, that we can talk about it. I think the first step is always just stop doing it, right? Stop the abuse first, and then, maybe we can start to heal. So now that we know what happened at Kamloops, what's going on? How are we moving forward with healing from that?
What we decided when I was on the board, even 10 years ago or so, is that healing right now has to be individual. So like in my book, my last chapter talks about my healing journey. And when the Truth and Reconciliation Commissioners, one of them, Willie Littlechild, he said healing has to begin with us alone, our families first. I had to forgive my parents for the way I was raised after understanding what happened to them at boarding school and why we were parented and disciplined, because we were disciplined the way they were at boarding school. We also decided that there isn't a one-fit-all healing model. Canada has 103 models that we can tap into. Our First Nations relatives across the medicine line are willing to help us look for healing models. It has to come from the community. Each community individually has to look at what healing looks like for them. We need to support our survivors. Right now, we don't have anything in place. I don't believe we do. NABS has some resources, but Canada has like a number to call. When my survivors, they called me, and I'm not a therapist or a counselor, so we need more support for survivors here in the United States. I'm a firm believer in talk therapy. The people that I interviewed, they also said a return to their language, a return to our tribal spirituality, a return to our culture is what would help heal them. So an apology, we talked about a national apology. I saw in 2008 what the apology did for boarding school people in First Nations across the medicine line. I'm for an apology, but I think that's kind of, maybe set aside right now for more pressing issues that we're looking at, like the Truth and Healing Commission on Indian boarding school policy. But I'm all for a policy from the government. Right now I'm hearing things about the Pope, but I don't know if that'll happen in my lifetime. So we're looking for the Secretary Deb Haaland I think the healing it can begin with her movement, with her healing commission. I have a letter from just before 1900 that was sent out by the Secretary of Interior at that, about 1989, that was sent out to all the federal boarding schools operating at that time, including Chemawa, Oregon, where my father was. And he said that students will no longer be able to be sent home because we can't afford it. If you apply for funds to send a student home, it will be denied. So that is the reason why we have cemeteries at boarding schools. And now fast forward to Deb Haaland, and like was said, I just wept when she talked about establishing this healing commission. So now we have her here that is looking for those unmarked graves. So how many years has it taken for us to get to this point? And we want land back. We want our babies to come home, like what's happening at Carlisle. I know there's unmarked graves here at St. Michael's and at Fort Taunton. I've brought a film crew out there. And that's just one school. There's 408 schools that she needs to look at. So she's got one heck of a job there. But I think the healing can begin. NABS, I know we've been working for a decade to bring the boarding school issue to a national level. We wanted a congressional inquiry for over 10 years. So it took, I say in their slumber they woke a nation, it took these babies and the news of the unmarked graves to wake up our nation.
Wow. Thank you, Denise. We all appreciate those words. Is there anything you want to add before we continue on the discussion? Okay. Thank you so much, Denise. Her book is Stringing Rosaries, if you're interested, if you're watching at home and interested. We do need to move on to the next segment. If you're just joining us, welcome to the Native News Online Indian Boarding Schools discussion. This is the first of a three-part series. Thank you for joining us. My name is Valerie Vandepan. I am the managing editor of Native News Online and one of the co-hosts of this program. We again thank our platinum presenting sponsor, Tanika Biloxi Tribe of Louisiana, and also our gold sponsor, Think, Yahoo, Verizon Media. Our second discussion is about finding relatives. We're joined now by two reporters. Jenny Monet is Laguna Pueblo and an investigative journalist and author of the weekend newsletter Indigenously, Decolonizing Your Newsfeed. And we are also joined by Sierra Clark, Ottawa from the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Ojibwe. She is a journalist who traced her family history as it relates to boarding schools and reported on the experience for the Traverse City Record Eagle. First, Jenny, let's start. Can you orient us a little bit, please? What is the Outing Project and how does it relate to the Arrow reporting residency?
Well, go see Valerie. Thank you very much, and good everybody out there. It's an honor to be here sharing with so many esteemed people who have been doing this work for so long, and to talk about this very important moment that we're all experiencing. Jenny Monet Hinome Koe Koe I Anishinaabe Moda Hiratsida. My name is Jenny Monet. I'm a citizen of the Laguna Pueblo Big Turkey Clan, and I'm also a descendant of Turtle Mountain Chippewa. And I've been reporting recently about my own family's legacy linked to my great-grandfather's experience with the Carlisle Indian Boarding School and its program. And if you know anything about Carlisle, that program went hand in hand with the government agenda to assimilate us as part of its outsized effort for westward expansion. And, what we know about the Outing program has been documented and chronicled across the board throughout Carlisle's 39-year legacy. From the time that the school started, there was an understanding that to remove children from their homelands and their actual homes with their families who spoke their language, who practiced their cultures and their ways, was the absolute effort to make effective all that this boarding school was intended for, cultural change. And so to return children back to their homes in time after school was over was considered to be an actual setback to that agenda, to that master plan. And so the Outing program was a baked in circumstance to the actual curriculum of school. Children, both girls and boys, would be sent throughout the Eastern Seaboard with a concentration in Eastern Pennsylvania as servitude, really. Boys were sent as farmhands. Girls were sent as homemakers. And it's really interesting because the experiences of these children are so different. They're very documented. And in large cases, they are returned with hardship. We know that some of the children who went out on these outings for months at a time never returned. Either they disappeared. We know that through Carlisle, they have documented with as many as a dozen who died, including a few suicides in these detachments from the school itself. And so when I look at those sorts of stories, I think of double displacement trauma when we're talking about students who've been removed from their indigenous homelands and then from their support network, perhaps at the Carlisle boarding school, to be living, in strange homes with strange white people that they don't know, and that that they're forced to adapt or face all kinds of other consequences. And so I've been doing a lot of reporting about that through the lens of my great-grandfather, a Laguna Pueblo man who went to Carlisle in 1906 through 1909 and participated in the outing program every year. And what it has revealed to me is, I think, what Christine has mentioned to us about how this legacy of these boarding schools, beginning with Carlisle, is incredibly complex. There are many layers to what the agenda was at that time and who the actors were. And for me, what my investigation has returned serves to what I think Brian Newlin, Christine, Dr. Lashmadir have all touched upon, is that, this is an incredible healing process, incredibly individualistic at this time. And I think also one that we just are putting the pieces together for the very first time in ways that is taking an incredible emotional toll, including myself. And so this work has been one that I've come to with great care. And as someone who's reported on Indian country for a couple of decades now, I felt like I understood the wave of attention that was going to come to people like the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, who's been doing this work for a long time, and like many other people who've been doing this work have been ignored, discounted, dismissed for this kind of advocacy, and now there's an inundation of it. And my immediate concern was an exploitation of these traumas, an exploitation individually, because we're already used to that in other situations. And so I am doing this story concert with a reporting residency program for descendants of Carlisle to reclaim their narrative. But through Carlisle and its outing program itself was that it was an incredibly propagandized within the Carlisle boarding school newspapers itself as a way to drum support for the school, and it had real manipulation living at the heart of what was documented in these papers. It's hard to read. And so there's I think, while talk therapy is incredibly helpful, I also feel like, as someone whose job it has been is to chronicle these hard stories for our people for many years, writing about them and understanding the root of them is also incredibly helpful. And I just want to invite anybody who wants to go on that journey with me to do so. I can talk a little bit more about the arrow. I'll put it in the chat notes to the website. But thank you so much, Valerie.
Valerie, just real quick, I just want our readers to know that Native News Online will be carrying the stories that Jenny is currently working on. And I think I don't know how many part series, but we talked about it last week. And yet to be determined, but we are looking forward to that, Jenny. And thank you very much for your hard work.
Thank you for sharing so much of that, Jenny. It's I might have a follow-up question for you if we have the time, but let's talk with Sierra now. Sarah, you've also really felt the magnitude and complexity of the boarding school issue and its impact on your own life and your own family. Can you talk about the legacy boarding schools left in your life?
Yeah, bonjour, Ani, Sierra Indigenous Kaz, Kichiwik Bidong Singandojaba, Odawa Anda, Makwa Andoram. My name is Sierra. I am from the place of the Great Bay, which is now Traverse City, Michigan. I am Odawa, a descendant of the Grand Traverse Band of Odawa and Ojibwe, and I am Bear Clan. Growing up, I was devoid of my Odawa traditions and culture. Despite growing up that, knowing that I was Native American, I didn't understand what it was to be Anishinaabe. And the way that I became aware of my family's histories was actually from reporting on residential boarding schools as a journalist for the Traverse City Record-Eagle. I was assigned to look into the residential boarding schools and the complex histories that were in Michigan. And so there were rumors that swirled around my family throughout my upbringing that we had a relative in a boarding school. But the rumors we summed up to just being of something that happened maybe a long, long time ago, even if it were, maybe if it were true. We thought that we just became assimilated into a colonial, world over the years, and it was far from the truth. While I was looking over records of student names that had attended the Mount Pleasant Indian Industrial Boarding School, I came across my great-grandfather's name, and my heart sank. I thought maybe it was a different Cletus Antwine. So I dug deeper and found out that my great-grandfather and all of his siblings and his aunts and uncles also attended this school, and it extended back a few generations. And this was only one part of my family lineage I have looked at. I'm still processing that trauma and haven't looked further into any other family members or any other schools. My great-grandmother, Helena Smith, she spoke our language fluently. My uncles and aunties have stories of them tiptoeing into the halls as children to listen in on her and their grandmother speak, because they would never speak language on the children, and they would immediately close their lips if any of the children came into the room. So they didn't pass our language down. And my Uncle Tom told me one day he asked them if they could learn too, and he was told firmly, and he remembers this distinctly, no, you're living in a white man's world. We don't want you to go through what we went through. He didn't at the time know what that meant. He just kind of summed it up to the racism that they lived through every day. And he didn't really think it was residential boarding schools, because he said that his father, Cletus, never spoke of the schools. None of his aunties or uncles spoke of it. It was never brought up. And there was a lot of fear in growing up the way that I did. And I know now that a lot of it stemmed from how residential boarding schools affected my family. My uncle told me stories growing up of unexpected visitors coming to the door. And at that knock, they were instructed to go and hide and stay quiet. They were even sometimes taken in the dead of the night to a cabin deep in the woods, sometimes for days to hide out. And he never understood what they were hiding from until we went over these records. This fear was passed down into a game for me growing up. My mother was always so nervous at unexpected visitors. I remember the way her face would just go pale at the sound of someone at the door. And in that intensity, almost in unison, the blood memory of my sisters and I as children, we would go quickly, quietly, swiftly, and unseen into our rooms and wait. I don't remember knowing what to wait for, just compacting every part of my body so not to make a slightest sound until my mother came into the back room and said it was okay, it was safe. And this game was passed down by her mother, my grandmother, who knew it wasn't safe to be Native American. The residential boarding school stole our family's language, our knowledge, how to use traditional medicines, our songs, our connections to Aki, which is the land. It robbed us of our family's place within our community, and in turn we were given a dark, commonly used phrase of "it runs in the family," for excusing our ways to cope with the traumas and the pains that stem back from generation after generation. The magnitude of residential boarding schools is a thread that ties every Native American together living today. The histories of these schools are still alive today through living survivors and generational survivors like myself.
What do you even say to that? It's challenging, and I know that it's challenging, and I'm so grateful that you're taking the time to share your stories with us. I have more questions for both of you, and I would love to spend some more time on this, but we are pressed for time at this moment, so we need to move on to the next segment. If there is time for questions at the end, we will loop back and ask them. So thank you both very much. If you're just tuning in, you're watching the Native News Online Indian Boarding Schools discussion. This is the first of a three-part webinar series. Thank you for joining us. My name is Valerie Vandepan, and I am the managing editor of Native News Online, and I'm also one of the hosts of this program. Native News Online would like to thank, again, our platinum presenting sponsor, the Tunica Biloxi Tribe of Louisiana. Our next discussion is looking at where we are at now and what's next. Joining us are Christopher Eaglebear Sichangu from the Sichangu Youth Council, who in late July co-repatriated 9 ancestors. Also joining us is Lauren Peters Agdagu. She's a Agdagu tribe, excuse me. She is the PhD scholar at UC Davis in Native American Studies with a designation in human rights. She works finding and documenting Alaska Native children and tracking them as they are repatriated. Thank you both for joining us today. I appreciate both of you and your work. Let's actually, Christopher, we'll start with your story of being a young person who worked to repatriate your ancestors. Can you tell us a little bit about that story, please?
Yes. On the Rosebud Indian Reservation, we have a youth group called the Sichanga Youth Group. And about 6 years ago, when I was 16, 17, the group and I went to a Unity conference in Washington, D.C., hosted by the White House. And, the boarding school, Carlisle, what we did was not a part of the journey at all. It was just something that came up while we were coming home. So on the last day of Unity, we're on our way back, and we stop in at Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It was on the way home. And when we stopped there, for a lot of us, me included, it was the first time I've ever been introduced to what a boarding school was and what it really meant to me as a Lakota person. Because back at home, they don't talk about it. It's something that we kind of shy away from because of how much it hurts. And while we were there, we were given a tour of what the school was and how it was ran. But when you get to the school, the first thing that you notice is this. You notice the cemetery, and in the cemetery, there's over 216 kids there, and 13 of them are Lakota, but 9 of them are from the Sichanga Nation. And while we were there, one of the members of the youth group popped the question, why don't we bring them home? And we didn't have a question. We didn't have an answer for that. And so we came home with that in our head. And so from there, we went to the tribal council here on Rosebud, and we asked them the same question. Why don't we bring them home? And the same thing. They didn't have an answer for that either. So they said, why don't we bring them home? And so they pushed to move the following that we, bring them home. And 6 years later, trials and tribulations, we were able to do it and successfully bring the 9 Rosebud Rosebud remains home. And anyways, it was very eye-opening for me. Whenever I first started this program, I was very shy. I didn't know very much about boarding schools and what it meant. And come to find out, my grandparents were both products of a boarding school here on the Rosebud Indian Reservation. But it's something that they never talked about, and I never knew why until after I did the research and moved forward with the project that I'm a part of. And so 6 years later, we came to Carlisle to the group that went 6 years ago came back, and we went to Carlisle with a couple of our spiritual leaders, and we had a ceremony and to bring back the remains of the 9 lost children that were there. And while we were there, it came to me that this is going to be a lot bigger than what it was, because there were a lot of people. There were a lot of people there that were in higher seats, like Secretary of Interior Deb Haaland. She was one of them, and the actor Mark Ruffalo. He came down too to show his support. There were a lot of people that showed their support in this, and that's when you realize that this thing was a lot bigger than what you thought it was going to be. Because when we first started, there's only a handful of people that were helping. And so it was very, very, very warming to know that we all can come together for something bigger than us. And so from Carlisle, we came home with the 9 children. And on our way home, we stopped through a few of the reservations on the way back, one in Iowa and one in Sioux City. And when we stopped in Iowa, we weren't expecting a big thing either. But when we got there, the whole community was at the gymnasium waiting for us to arrive. And they were really nice. They really extended their hands out to us in a good way. And so we ate food with them, and we shared words with them. And then from there, we moved on to Sioux City. And when we got to Sioux City, we got there kind of late because we left a little late. But they were still waiting for us, even at the wee hours of the night at 1 a.m, which was very nice of them. They didn't have to do that, but they did. And so from there, we had the food that they shared with us, and the man there shared a story with us and why he did this. And so the next morning, with the few hours of sleep that we had, we woke up at 7, and we met with the rest of our tribe at this outside the stadium arena. And from there, we said some prayers, just shared some words, and then we started the procession back home. And the procession itself was a beautiful thing. That was the first time in my 23 years that I've seen my reservation, all the programs come together for a cause bigger than themselves. And each one of these programs played a part in helping these kids come back. And I'm very, I'm very grateful for that. That's what we're all about as Lakota people. And, it takes a kid to move a nation like that. And these 9 children were that cause of that nation moved. And so from Sioux City, Iowa, we went through Santee Reservation, then up to the other reservations on the way home. And this wasn't just like a Native affair at this point. The state of South Dakota helped us out too, with their South Dakota highway patrolmen helping us escort through each county that we were going through. And then finally, we took them to where they departed, the last place they seen before they went to Carlisle, before they entered that train. It was the Wheatstone Landing site, and it's just off of the Missouri River. And from the Wheatstone Landing site, we came to the college here in Rosebud, the St. Iglesias University College, to where the first wake would be. And then from the wake, some of the children some of the family members, descendants of the family members, took their ancestors back to their home graves. And the other ones, we put them in a veterans cemetery. And not because, they came from a industrial school, of which Carlisle is now considered an industrial military school. We put them there with the idea that the warriors who come from our land that served in the military, that are buried at the veteran cemetery, can watch over these children and know that they'll always be free now. And as for these 9 children, if they choose to come back into this world again, they'll live a better life than what they lived over 142 years ago. One thing about this whole experience was that, this is real life that no one talks about. This is something that we choose to hide from, that we choose to not talk about because of the trauma and the pain that it brings. One thing after this that I realized was there were a lot of people, a lot of the older generations, like around my grandparents' generation, that started to share their stories because they felt that they finally had a space that was safe enough for them to share the traumatic histories of what they've gone through, where they've been through. Even my own grandmother started sharing with me some of the things that she's went through. And all I can say is it's very horrific. I understand why we don't talk about these things now. And as for some of the members, a lot of them, are now becoming mothers and fathers, and they're understanding the idea of like being a parent and what it means to have a child taken away from you. So we're very grateful for the way things happened, and we're very happy that they happened the way they did.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you, Christopher, for sharing that story. That's amazing. And thank you. We're running out of time here, but I do want to bring on Lauren, who can please share with us, a little bit about where we're at right now with repatriation and what's next. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank everybody on this panel. It really takes a village. It took Christopher to ask the question and the other youth to ask the question for me to get my relative back. And I have to make a small correction from your video that it was 9 Rosebud Sioux that came home and 1 Alaska Native. My second great aunt, I brought her back to St. Paul Island, which is an island in the middle of the Bering Sea, which has full of Unanga people from the Aleutian Islands. So thank you very much for all your work that you've done. I rematriated my aunt this summer, and for what comes next, so Sophia was the first Alaska Native to come home from Carlisle. There's a large cemetery at Chemawa Indian School in Oregon, and there's about 60 Alaska Natives there, about 200 more children there. And to think about what Denise said about 408 boarding schools, 85% of our people were at one time in a boarding school. And each one of these boarding schools had their own cemetery full of our children. And I realize how lucky I am to have my relative in a marked grave with on an army barracks that was protected for 106 years or 115 years. And that there is documentation of where she was, so I could go and get her and bring her home. And I know a lot of other people aren't that lucky. I'm really looking forward to working with Mr. Newland and with the Secretary Holland so that we can find and document and bring our children home, which will help our healing. When I brought Sophia home to St. Paul Island, like Christopher said, the whole community came out. And we met her at the airport. We paraded her around the whole town into the church, and then we sang her into the cemetery. And I felt that she was at peace, and I felt the whole community came together for a meal, and we sang Unanga songs, and we talked about her, and we talked about her sister who was also lost. And we are in the process of finding these lost children. And that is a sense of justice, and it's a sense of healing. And it is saying that the government can no longer do these things to us. And we, as an Unanga woman, can find our Unanga children and bring them home. And that's a big sense of power that we're bringing back to the community. I'd just like to thank this panel and the sponsors for bringing us here so we could have this conversation. It's a really important conversation to have. And I look forward to continuing it with all of you.
Wow. Lauren, thank you so much. I really like, we do unfortunately have to end this program, but I really like ending it on the empowerment note, because it is a sense of power and growing power that we are getting our ancestors back. We are getting our relatives back. We are understanding what happened, and we're taking back what was stolen. And that empowerment is huge. So thank you for pointing us in that direction. I appreciate it so much. Thank you for sharing your story. Levi, do you want to add anything?
Well, Valerie, I just want to say that the guests, including the Assistant Secretary of the Interior for Indian Affairs, Brian Newland, and all the guests have been very powerful, very insightful. I just wish we had more time to talk about this, but I just want to remind our readers of Native News Online that we will continue to cover this very, very important story. As Assistant Secretary Newland said, there has not been one family, Native American family, whether they know it or not, has been negatively or impacted by Indian boarding schools. So, and thank you, Valerie, for doing a great job today.
Oh, thank you, Levi. We know it's been a difficult and challenging discussion, and we are so grateful for our panelists for sharing their insights with us today. And I'm sorry we don't have time for questions to our audience, but we're so grateful for you two who watched this presentation, who sat here with us and sat with us for the last hour listening. Thank you so much. If you do want to learn more about these issues and follow the issue of boarding schools as it develops, please visit our website, nativenewsonline.net, and be sure to sign up for our newsletter so you can stay informed. It is an ongoing issue, and we will continue to cover it. Our next boarding school webinar is scheduled for February of 2022. We will post on our website, and we will also post on our social, and we'll make the announcement in our newsletter as well. So if you want to, be the first to know when that next webinar is happening, please be sure to sign up. Native News Online would also like to thank our sponsors again, Platinum presenting sponsor Tunica Biloxi Tribe of Louisiana, and our gold sponsor, OTHINK, Yahoo, Verizon Media, and our silver sponsor, Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation. We'd also like to thank our producer, Danielle Kramer, Dan Salas, Jenna Coons, Kristen Lilia, Brian Edwards, and everyone who made this presentation possible. We especially thank you, our audience, for caring about this issue and for joining us on this journey. Thank you. Again, if you'd like to continue to follow our boarding school discussion and our work at Native News Online, please be sure to visit our website, nativenewsonline.net, and be sure to sign up for our newsletter. Thank you.